Now I give the floor to Dr. Indrek Paavle. He's a historian who works in the Estonian University, Tartu University. He will speak on the aspects of violation of the basic rights in the Soviet Union, restriction of movement and residency. The floor is yours, Dr. Paavle.
Dear guests and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for sitting here and waiting for me. My presentation had to be in two parts. Alongside the main topic, I was asked to provide an overview of violations of human rights in Estonia in 1953 to 1991 at this conference. But you all saw at the beginning, in the beginning of this panel, how my basic human rights were violated. I mean, freedom of speech, and only 15 minutes were allotted to me. This way I can only name those topics which has been dealt with to a certain extent in Estonian historiography. For example, the topic of dissidents. For example, the topic of penal psychiatry. After that, alongside topics that consider violation of human rights on the personal level, topics that deal with this subject matter on a general level should be mentioned. For instance, the mechanism of censorship, the policy towards the Lutheran Church, the institutional framework of the regime, and so on. Especially party organizations, the government, and the other institutions of power and their mechanisms. And also the Soviet educational system has been studied in recent years, focusing on the ideological upbringing in schools. But now I continue with the second part of my presentation, and which the topic, this topic, however, is more interesting, at least for me. The goal of my presentation is to examine those aspects of the violation of human rights that are described in the Article 13. Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This article declares that, first, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the border of each state. And secondly, everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. These rights differed from the other human rights in that they were not included in the Constitution of the Soviet Union. The Constitution aimed to depict the Soviet Union as the world's most democratic country, and listed the basic rights and freedoms of its citizens, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, or the freedom to form organizations. Of course, that was all window dressing, but the right to move about freely and to choose one's place of residence was even not included in any version of the Soviet Constitution. The state strictly controlled and regulated movement within the state and where any given person lived. The main instrument of control was the internal passport system. It was established in the 1930s and existed without any fundamental changes until the end of the Soviet Union, actually even longer. This is a phenomenon with gay words such as regimen cities, regimen areas, restricted areas, border zones, and so on. And, for example, also residency registration. Thereafter, I use Russian word propiska. You all know that word. To briefly summarize, the passport regimen meant that every person's place of residence had to be officially registered, and a passport containing propiska was needed to change one's place of residence. Thus, legal changes in place of residence could only take place with permission from the authorities. Thus, residency registration or propiska was essentially a residence permit. Theoretically, the regime could control and direct employment and migration through this system, and it also had an overview of where any random citizen was at any given point of time. Different means were used to apply restrictions on place of residence. A continually changing list of so-called regimen regions existed where people with uncitable backgrounds, like for instance persons with criminal records, were forbidden to live. For this kind of person, special remarks were put into their passports. For many people returning from Siberia, this meant that they were forbidden to return home. The passport system was implemented gradually in the Soviet Union. A large proportion of the rural population did not receive passports until the early 1980s. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania formed an exception, where the entire population was issued passports in 1945 to 1947 already. But the privileged status was deceptive. The existence of the passport did not guarantee a greater freedom of movement. It did, however, make the control and surveillance of people easier. The citizenry was more transparent toward the passport system. The regime applied the passport system in the service of political repression. For instance, over 4,000 persons with hostile backgrounds were immediately put on record in Estonia in 1947, as soon as passports were issued. Nearly 2,500 Finns who had fled from Leningrad to Estonia to avoid deportation were sent into punishment with the help of the passport system. It directly affected people left behind from the mass deportation of 1949. There were nearly 10,000 such people in Estonia. Instruction had been issued from Moscow to not carry out the mass deportation of persons left behind from the first wave after the fact. But the deportation operation continued in concealed form, even though it took place under other judicial and formal pretexts that applied to hundreds of people who had initially escaped deportation. According to the Estonian SSR Ministry of Internal Affairs, over 1,600 people were sentenced to actual prison terms in the years of 1949 to 1953 on the basis of Article 192A of the Criminal Code concerning violation of the passport regimen. The obligatory additional penalty in their cases was deportation to the location assigned to them. Thus, the passport regimen was used to deport persons who had been caught toward some other offense but it was, however, also applied in the case of people whose only fault was missing their deportation train. Stalin's death did not change anything. The slight debating of the system in the summer of 1953 was short. New passport regulations were established in the Soviet Union in the autumn of 1953, which marked the beginning of the renewed tightening of the regime. This also gave the institution of propiska its final form. Propiska was made compulsory for everyone, including people who lived without passports, according to the law, like juveniles and a large proportion of the rural population of the Soviet Union. And the subsequent passport regulations in 1974 did not bring any fundamental changes. The penalization of violators of the passport regime was an important part of the system during the post-Stalin years as well. For instance, criminal penalties which were not assigned in 1954 to 1955, but in 1958, a special decree tightened penal policy according to which violators of propiska rules could be criminally convicted with a maximum penalty of 1.5 years imprisonment. Violators of the passport regime, however, were continually processed administratively. The 1950s did not bring any tendency towards a decrease in those violations. An average of 13,000 people per year were penalized administratively, even during the, so to say, more lenient years. While administrative penalties, mostly fines, now seem trivial compared to the Soviet regime's other deeds, it must be recalled that, among other things, repeated administrative penalties meant that the violation became a criminal offense, which led to a criminal case. The Estonian SSR Criminal Code went into effect in 1961 in place of the Russian Criminal Code. The article concerning violation of the passport regime was initially left out of it, but was added in 1966. Thereafter, the assignment of criminal penalties began with new vigor, and let's illustrate the extent of control and penal policy with some figures. For example, from 1967 to 83, people's passports and residency registration were controlled approximately 12 million times. In other words, over 800,000 per year. This data is based on MVD Department of Statistics. Maybe those numbers are wrong, but if the data is wrong, it shows the aspiration of the system. Let's watch those figures more. For example, from 1944 to 1991, at least 5,000 criminal penalties were assigned for violation of the passport regime, and during the same time, at least 400,000 administrative cases were processed. Of course, a large proportion of the persons who were penalized had violated the regime because of laziness, of carelessness. Without a doubt, there were social misfits or tramps. Yet decent people, so to speak, also violated the rules for different reasons. For instance, people tried to evade being sent to reserve military training in that way. But that is a fact that hundreds of people were imprisoned and expelled because they had tried to have a say in choosing their job or way of life by violating the regiment's rules. Now, the passport and propiska were just the tip of the iceberg of the whole system meant to control the population. A huge card file system formed the underwater portion of that iceberg. Here data was gathered concerning people's places of residence. The system was used for finding people. The address bureau system had been created in 1963 already for processing that card files. Here are some figures concerning the Estonian SSR from comprehending the scale of the system. From 1959 to 83, an average of 460,000 cards were added to the address form card file per year. During the same time, the address bureau responded to around 6.2 million inquiries. Of these, 4.1 million were requested by the KGB MD or the prosecutor's office. These huge figures indicate the readiness of the system, so to speak. The total control of people was intended. It kept people in fear and disciplined them. People had to learn to live within the framework set by the system. Now let us return to the definition of human rights referred to at the beginning of the presentation. The prohibition on leaving the country formed another facet of restrictions on movement. To this end, legal passage abroad was subjected to strict control and was made almost impossible for most people. Changes began taking place in terms of passage abroad in the 1970s, but that was a result of international pressure, not the inner wish of the regime. The border regimen, in other words, the border zone along with the special rules that applied in it was meant to hinder illegal departure from the country. The border zone was established in Estonia in the autumn of 1940 and again in the autumn of 1944. And administrative units, village Soviets bordering on Estonia's northern and northwestern coast and all maritime islands were part of the border zone. People could live in and enter into the border zone only with special permission. Certain categories of the population, including persons with criminal records, were not permitted to live in the border zone. The details of the border regimen regulations were modified several times, but fundamental changes did not take place until the end of the Soviet occupation. Only the regulation of 1967 can be considered an important change, since it established a series of border regimen rules in areas that were not part of the border zone. This charge applied throughout the Soviet Union. In the case of Estonia, this change affected the western coast, where there was no border zone. It was so-called unguarded coastline, but where strict restrictions on going out to sea were established regardless of this. So, in conclusion, I was asked to base my presentation on the theme of this conference and to focus on the years 1953 to 1991. It appears that if we are speaking of the violation of human rights in the Soviet Union, this kind of periodization is not appropriate. The basis for the operation of institutions did not change. Human rights were violated in the Soviet Union all the time, and Stalin's death did not change anything in this respect. Thank you for your attention.